A mansion that cries at midnight, or something far darker. Welcome to Tea and Clue. I am your host, Harrington. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Now let's step inside the Weeping Manor. It was a particularly fine afternoon in the village of St. Mildred's on the Green, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to sparkle with good manners and quiet gossip. The vicarage lawn was dotted with stalls selling marmalade, second-hand books and knitted tea cozies. Fay brass band played cheerfully under a canvas awning, slightly off-key but full of enthusiasm. Everyone agreed it was the most successful garden fete in years. Miss Jane Marple, now in her late 70s but still sharp-eyed and deceptively frail-looking, sat near the cake table beneath a striped umbrella. She observed the scene with mild interest, her knitting needles clicking in steady rhythm. To the untrained eye, she seemed absorbed in her lacework. In truth, she missed nothing. Children raced past in a blur of ribbons and jam-stained cheeks. Colonel Archibald Trevelyan, retired from the Indian Army and perpetually red-faced, was loudly boasting about his new motor car. Mrs. Penelope Lacey, the doctor's wife, fluttered about in a floral hat much too youthful for her years. And then, of course, there was Lady Agatha Vane, the centrepiece of every village gathering, sweeping through the fete as though it were her private court. Lady Agatha, elegant and imperious, was mistress of Weeping Manor, a vast, ivy-covered estate perched on the edge of the village. Its turrets peered through ancient elms like suspicious sentinels. The house had a tragic reputation. It was said to weep when misfortune approached. Some claimed to have heard its rainspouts sobbing even on dry nights. Miss Marple did not believe in curses, but she knew well enough that where superstition thrived, guilt often hid close behind. As the fete reached its height, Lady Agatha raised her glass of lemonade to make an announcement. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying over the music, "I have the most delightful surprise. After many years abroad, my nephew, Mr. Lawrence Vane, has returned to Weeping Manor. He shall be staying with me indefinitely." There was polite applause, a few raised eyebrows, and a ripple of whispered speculation. Lawrence Vane, the estranged nephew, he had been all but forgotten since his abrupt departure a decade earlier. Some said it was due to gambling debts. Others hinted at a broken engagement or worse. Miss Marple's knitting paused for the briefest second. She remembered Lawrence, charming, careless, and too clever for his own good. Moments later he appeared, tall, tanned, with the easy smile of a man accustomed to admiration. He greeted the villagers warmly, though there was something faintly uneasy in his eyes, a shadow that belied his charm. Lady Agatha clung to his arm with proud affection. Tea was poured, cakes were cut, and the fete continued merrily. Yet beneath the laughter an odd tension lingered, subtle but undeniable. Miss Marple noticed it in the stiff exchange between Lawrence and the local solicitor, Mr. Edmund Clay. She caught it again in the quick, jealous glance Mrs. Lacey threw at Lawrence when her husband laughed too heartily at one of his anecdotes, and she could not help but note the absence of the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Barnes, who was usually first to gossip and last to leave. It was not until late afternoon, when the brass band faltered mid-tune and a piercing scream shattered the air, that the fete's gaiety turned to horror. The crowd surged toward the sound near the rose garden, where young Emily Barnes, pale and trembling, stood beside the ornamental pond. Floating face down among the lilies was the unmistakable form of Lady Agatha Vane, her white parasol drifting slowly away. The music stopped. The laughter died. The only sound was the quiet trickle of the pond's fountain, and, faintly from somewhere beyond the trees, the eerie moan of wind against the stones of Weeping Manor. Miss Marple folded her knitting and stood. Her eyes, calm and bright as ever, surveyed the chaos with a kind of sad inevitability. "Ah," she murmured softly, to no one in particular. "I rather thought something dreadful was bound to happen." The vicarage garden once filled with the pleasant hum of conversation and the clatter of teacups, had fallen eerily silent. People stood frozen where they were, their faces pale, their hands clutching cups and plates as though afraid to move. A child began to cry quietly, the sound oddly jarring against the stillness. The brass band, confused and frightened, had stopped playing altogether, their instruments glinting in the waning sunlight. The fete, so carefully planned and joyously begun, had dissolved into panic and disbelief. Miss Marple moved with surprising steadiness through the growing commotion. Her eyes, gentle yet unflinching, swept over the scene as she approached the pond. The doctor, Harold Lacey, was already kneeling beside Lady Agatha's body, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. After a moment he looked up, his expression grave. "She's gone," he said softly. "She must have been dead for at least half an hour." Gasps rippled through the gathering. "Half an hour?" repeated Colonel Trevelyan, his ruddy complexion turning a blotchy grey. "But she was here. She gave that speech not 20 minutes ago." Miss Marple's brows drew together ever so slightly. "Time, Colonel," she said kindly, "has a way of seeming shorter in moments of pleasure and longer in moments of shock. Still, it's an interesting observation." Inspector Graves arrived within the hour, summoned hastily from the nearby town of Milchester. He was a large man with an air of perpetual exasperation, as though the world continually presented him with problems that failed to make sense. He took one look at Miss Marple and sighed quietly. "You again, Miss Marple?" "Only by coincidence, Inspector," she said mildly. "I had rather hoped to spend the afternoon admiring sponge cakes, not corpses." Graves knelt beside Lady Agatha's body. "No visible injuries," he muttered. "No sign of struggle. Could have been a heart attack, I suppose." "Possible," Miss Marple agreed, "though I should think she was the picture of health not an hour ago. One does not usually make grand pronouncements about family reunions, and then die without some external prompting." The inspector glanced at her with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. "External prompting, you say? You mean poison?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she gazed toward the half-empty lemonade glass still resting on the table near the bandstand. "Perhaps," she said softly. "Or perhaps something subtler still." By evening, the fete had broken apart like a paper lantern in the rain. Villagers drifted homeward in hushed clusters, their whispers following them down every lane. In St. Mildred's, tragedy was both a horror and a kind of entertainment, and no one could resist contributing their piece of speculation. At the vicarage, Mrs. Banbury, the vicar's wife, sat rigidly in her armchair, listening to her guests as though each word were a sermon. "It's dreadful," she declared for the 5th time. "Simply dreadful. And to think, right here in our own garden. I told her that parasol was bad luck. White is for weddings and ghosts." "Rubbish," snorted Colonel Trevelyan. "It's that nephew of hers, you mark my words. Never trusted him. Comes back after 10 years abroad, and within hours the old lady's dead. Convenient, I'd say." Mrs. Lacey pursed her lips. "Lawrence adored his aunt. Besides, he seemed genuinely shocked." "Actors always do," the colonel retorted. Miss Marple said nothing. She sat quietly by the window, her knitting in her lap, though her hands were still. Through the glass she could see the distant silhouette of Weeping Manor, its windows glimmering faintly in the dusk. The house did seem to brood over the village, its chimneys like sentinels watching from the dark. She recalled Lady Agatha's words that afternoon, her pride in her nephew's return, her smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she remembered something else, Lawrence's reaction when his aunt had mentioned his indefinite stay. A pause, brief but definite, the faintest tightening of his jaw before his charm reasserted itself. Most would not have noticed. But Miss Marple always noticed. Later that evening, Inspector Graves came calling. "I've just come from Weeping Manor," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into the vicarage sitting-room. "Can't make head nor tail of it. The servants swear Lady Agatha was fine this morning. Tight breakfast took her walk, no sign of distress. Her nephew says she'd been perfectly cheerful all day. No enemies, no reason for, well, whatever this is. People seldom need reasons, Inspector, Miss Marple replied gently. Only motives. He frowned. Aren't they the same thing? Oh, no, she said with a faint smile. A reason is logical. A motive is human. And humanity, in my experience, is rarely logical. Graves sighed. Well, we'll know more when the post-mortem's done. In the meantime, I'll have to ask that no one leave the village. That night the news spread like wildfire. The vicar's telephone rang until nearly midnight, carrying fresh morsels of rumour. Lady Agatha had been poisoned. The pond had been cursed. Lawrence Vane had quarrelled with her that morning. The housekeeper had disappeared. The manor was haunted again. By dawn, every cottage in St. Mildred's had a theory, and every theory contradicted the last. Miss Marple, awake early as always, sat by her window watching the mist creep over the green. She thought of Lady Agatha's final moments. The body had been found face down, unnatural, almost deliberate. The parasol floating away, the stillness of the pond, the curious absence of struggle. Death, when sudden, often left chaos in its wake. But this had been strangely serene. She rose and crossed to her writing desk, where a small notebook lay open. Her pen scratched quietly as she made a list. Lawrence Vane, returned from abroad. Financial troubles? Possible inheritance. Edmund Clay, solicitor. Tense exchange observed at fete. Disagreement? Mrs. Lacey, resentful. Jealous glance noted. Dr. Lacey, nervous, unsteady at scene. Why, Mrs. Barnes, missing from fete entirely. Where was she? She paused, tapping the pen against her chin. 5 names, 5 stories, each a thread in what promised to be a very tangled web. At precisely 9 o'clock there came a knock at her door. It was young Emily Barnes, still pale from yesterday's ordeal. Miss Marple, she whispered, you must come. They found something dreadful by the manor gates. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. She reached for her shawl and her handbag. Then we mustn't keep them waiting, she said quietly. As they stepped out into the chill morning, the church bells tolled faintly in the distance, their echo mingling with the soft, sorrowful sigh of the wind through the trees. And somewhere beyond, the ancient walls of Weeping Manor seemed to murmur their secrets once more. The road leading to Weeping Manor was still damp with the morning's dew, the grass heavy and dark along its edges. Mist hung low, curling about the iron gates where a small cluster of villagers had gathered, their curiosity outweighing their sense of propriety. Emily Barnes clutched Miss Marple's arm tightly as they approached, her breath coming quick and uneven. The inspector's car stood parked just beyond the gates, its engine ticking faintly in the chill air. A constable stepped forward to block their way, but hesitated when he saw who it was. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, tugging his cap. "Best not come too close, ma'am. Inspector's orders." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "I assure you, Constable, I've no intention of interfering. But perhaps you might tell me what has been found." The young man shifted uncomfortably. Well, a scarf, ma'am. A lady's scarf. Looks like blood on it, too." Emily gave a small cry. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand over the girl's trembling fingers. "Thank you, Constable," she said softly. "And may I ask where exactly it was found?" "Caught on the manor gates just there, as if someone tried to pull it free in a hurry." He pointed to the twisted metal, where indeed a scrap of silk fluttered faintly in the breeze. It was torn, the pattern delicate, white flowers on pale green. "That belonged to Lady Agatha," Emily whispered. "I saw her wearing it just yesterday." Inspector Graves emerged from behind the hedge, his face set in irritation. "Miss Marple, I might have known," he said, striding over. "You've the devil's knack for appearing wherever you're least wanted." "Only where I'm most needed, Inspector," she replied mildly. He grunted. "Nothing much to see here. Scarf's torn, blood-stained, though the doctor thinks it's not recent. We'll send it to the lab. Could have snagged there days ago for all we know." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the silk swaying lightly. Or perhaps it was placed there, she murmured. Graves scowled. And why would anyone do that? To be found, she said simply. The inspector muttered something about village theatricals and went back to his men. But Miss Marple stood in thoughtful silence, her gaze lingering on the gates, the narrow drive beyond, and the long shadow of the manor itself. They allowed her to accompany Emily back through the village, and as they walked, Miss Marple's mind turned over the pieces quietly, fitting and refitting them without haste. "You were fond of Lady Agatha, I think," she said gently. "Oh, yes, Mum," Emily replied, sniffling. "She was always kind to me. Sent us a turkey every Christmas. But she could be sharp sometimes if she didn't like a person. And who might she not have liked?" Emily hesitated. "Well, she wasn't very fond of Mr. Clay, the solicitor. Said he was far too interested in her affairs. And she didn't trust Mr. Lawrence much, though she pretended to. Once I overheard her tell Mrs. Banbury that she feared he'd bring ruin to the family if he ever returned." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human affection and mistrust do make curious bedfellows, my dear. One so often masquerades as the other." When they reached the village green, the day had begun in earnest. Men were sweeping up the remnants of the fete, and Mrs. Banbury stood in the doorway of the vicarage, giving orders like a field marshal. Gossip already flew faster than any bird in St. Mildred's. Miss Marple could hear snatches as she passed. Poison, jealousy, old grudges, and now, of course, the scarf. Inside the vicarage kitchen, Mrs. Lacey sat with a cup of tea clutched tightly in her hands. Her husband, the doctor, paced near the stove, his brow furrowed. When Miss Marple entered, both looked up quickly. "Terrible business," Dr. Lacey muttered. "They're saying it's murder now, though the inspector hasn't confirmed anything. Poor Lady Agatha. A dreadful shock." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, taking a seat. "Most dreadful. Though I imagine you've seen worse shocks in your time, Doctor." He blinked, unsure if it was a question or an observation. "Well, yes, I suppose. Still, one doesn't expect—" He broke off, fidgeting with his cufflinks. "Did you know Lady Agatha well?" Miss Marple asked. "Professionally, yes," he said quickly. "I'd been her physician for years. Nothing remarkable about her health, just the usual complaints of age." Mrs. Lacey's voice, brittle and too bright, interrupted. "She had enemies, I'm sure. That house of hers attracts trouble like a magnet. First her husband's scandal, then the servants running off, now this. I dare say it's cursed." "Curses," Miss Marple said with gentle finality, "are very rarely responsible for human death, Mrs. Lacey. People, on the other hand, nearly always are." She left them soon after, declining another cup of tea. Outside, the air had turned crisp. Across the green, Lawrence Vane was standing beside his aunt's chauffeur, speaking in low tones. His posture was controlled, almost too controlled. When he caught sight of Miss Marple, he offered a polite smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, quite the tragedy, isn't it? My poor aunt, she adored these village gatherings." "Indeed," she said, her voice mild. "I understand you've been away for some years." He nodded. 10, to be precise. "South America, mostly. Business ventures that didn't quite prosper." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Prosperity can be an elusive friend. And yet one always seems to make do, doesn't one?" Lawrence's smile tightened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "You're very observant, Miss Marple." "Merely attentive," she replied. "Old habits die hard." The inspector appeared again then, calling Lawrence aside, and Miss Marple watched the two men walk toward the Manor Road. She caught only fragments of their exchange. Inheritance, solicitor's papers, signature pending. Each word hung in the air like a clue waiting to be named. That afternoon, the wind picked up, carrying with it the first chill hint of rain. Miss Marple returned home and took her place by the hearth. The flames danced faintly as she considered the day's events, the scarf, the inheritance, the strange calm of Lady Agatha's death. All of it pointed toward something deliberate, something arranged with a hand both careful and cold. She thought, too, of Mrs. Barnes, the missing housekeeper. Silence could often be as telling as words, and if the woman had vanished the very day her mistress was found dead, then her absence was not coincidence. As dusk crept in, a knock sounded at the door. It was young Tom Pierce, the postboy, looking pale and uncertain. "Message for you, Miss Marple," he stammered, handing her a small rain-spotted envelope. She opened it slowly. The note inside was brief, written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. "If you value your life, stay away from Weeping Manor." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the words, her face unreadable. Then she folded the note neatly, set it beside her knitting, and murmured, "Oh dear, how very inconvenient." The candle on Miss Marple's small writing desk flickered as the evening wind slipped through the crack of the window pane. She sat perfectly still. The anonymous note opened before her, its message stark and oddly theatrical. "If you value your life, stay away from Weeping Manor." It was not the kind of thing one received in St. Mildred's every day. But then again, death was not the kind of thing one expected at a garden fete either. Still, Miss Marple was not easily frightened. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of her cardigan, resolving to make no mention of it to Inspector Graves, at least not yet. The truth, she reflected, had a habit of revealing itself most readily when one allowed others to underestimate one's curiosity. She spent the rest of the evening reviewing her notes. Lady Agatha's death, the scarf, the inheritance, the missing housekeeper. Each detail formed part of a pattern, though the pattern itself remained elusive. There was a rhythm to human wickedness, Miss Marple often said to herself. If one could only discern its beat, one might foresee its next step. By the time she set down her pen, the clock on the mantel had struck 10, and rain began tapping softly against the window. It was, she thought, a perfect night for secrets. The following morning brought no sunshine, only a dim, watery light that filtered through the mist. The inspector's car passed Miss Marple's cottage just after breakfast, heading once again toward the manor. She decided it was as good a moment as any to pay a visit of her own. She wrapped herself in her dark blue shawl, took up her umbrella and set out along the lane. The village dogs barked as she passed, and the postman touched his cap, but few others were about. The storm had left puddles that reflected the overhanging branches like dark glass. When she reached Weeping Manor, she found the gates open and the constable from the previous morning standing guard. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said uneasily. "The inspector's inside with Mr. Clay, something about the will." "Ah," she said gently, "then perhaps my timing is fortuitous." The constable hesitated but did not stop her. She made her way up the gravel drive, the stones crunching softly beneath her shoes. The manor loomed above, its windows streaked with rain, its ivy dripping like tears. The house seemed older today, wearier somehow, as though aware of the scandal it now sheltered. Inside, the great hall was dimly lit, the scent of damp stone mingling with that of extinguished candles. Lawrence Vane was standing near the hearth, speaking in low tones to Edmund Clay. His expression was taut, but his voice, when he greeted her, was smooth as ever. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. I suppose everyone in the village must think me a villain by now." "I doubt that," she replied kindly. "Villagers are inclined to believe the worst of people they dislike, and you, Mr. Vane, seem to have made yourself rather too charming for that." A flicker of amusement touched his mouth. "I'll take that as a compliment, though I can't imagine why anyone would find me charming today. Inspector Graves has spent the morning accusing me of everything short of witchcraft." Clay, who had been riffling through a set of papers, looked up sharply. "No one is accusing you of anything, Lawrence. The inspector simply needs to establish who benefits from Lady Agatha's estate." "And that would be me," Lawrence said flatly. "Unless, of course, my aunt changed her will, which, knowing her, is entirely possible." Miss Marple's eyes rested lightly on the solicitor. "Mr. Clay, I wonder, had Lady Agatha been in communication with you recently regarding her testament?" He adjusted his spectacles. Yes, she summoned me here 2 days before her death. She intended to revise certain clauses. We discussed them, but she never signed the final draft. I left it here on her writing desk for her to review. I suppose it's still in her study. The inspector entered then, his coat spattered with rain. Not anymore, he said grimly. The draft is missing. A silence fell. Lawrence's brows lifted. Missing? Surely you don't think Graves cut him off. I think it's very odd that the one document that could alter the line of inheritance vanishes the day after the testatrix dies. Either someone didn't want her changes known, or someone wanted to ensure they were. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Curious, she murmured. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone seen Mrs. Barnes yet? Still no sign of her, he admitted. The staff claim she left yesterday morning to visit her sister in Wenton, but there's no record of her arriving there. The bus driver says he saw no one matching her description. Lawrence exhaled sharply. If you're suggesting she stole the will, that's absurd. She was devoted to my aunt. Devotion, Miss Marple said softly, is often an untidy emotion. It can lead to rather desperate acts when combined with fear or resentment. The inspector gave her a look, halfway between annoyance and admiration. You think the housekeeper's mixed up in this? I think, she said, that Lady Agatha was a woman who valued control above all things. People like that make both loyal servants and dangerous enemies. Later, when the questioning had subsided, Miss Marple requested permission to look about the garden. The inspector, weary of resisting her, relented. She wandered down the terrace steps toward the ornamental pond where Lady Agatha had been found. The lilies floated pale and still upon the surface. The water itself reflected the grey sky like a sheet of glass. Kneeling by the edge, she examined the flagstones carefully. One stone near the base of the sundial bore a faint smear of what looked like rust or dried blood. Nearby lay a small broken object half hidden among the reeds. She reached for it delicately and found the handle of a letter opener. Its blade snapped clean off. When she straightened, Lawrence Vane was standing behind her, watching. You have quite the eye, Miss Marple, he said. Do you think my aunt was stabbed? She studied him a moment before replying. Not necessarily, but it's a strange place for a letter opener, don't you think? Unless someone wished to dispose of it quickly. He smiled faintly. You make it sound as if I had a hand in it. I make no assumptions, Mr. Vane, she said calmly. I merely observe. The rain began again, soft at first, then steady. Miss Marple tucked the broken handle into her pocket before turning back toward the house. She did not see Lawrence's expression change as she walked away, the brief flash of alarm that crossed his face before he mastered it. By the time she reached the lane, twilight had begun to fall. Their carriage approached from the opposite direction, and through the mist she recognized the driver, young Samuel Potts, the errand boy from the grocer's. He slowed as he passed. Evening, Miss Marple. They say the manor's haunted again. Lamps seen burning in the west wing, though no one's there. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes thoughtful. Haunted, perhaps, she said, but not, I think, by the dead. She continued homeward, her steps slow but certain, the weight of the broken letter opener pressing lightly against her pocket. Somewhere behind her, in the vast hollow of Weeping Manor, a single window flickered to life, as though the house itself were watching. Miss Marple slept lightly that night, as she always did when something was unsettled in her mind. The rain had ceased some time before dawn, leaving the air heavy and damp, and the first grey light of morning crept across her room like a cautious visitor. She rose, made her tea, and sat by the window overlooking the village green. It was the hour when St. Mildred's lay utterly still, the chimneys only just beginning to smoke, and the church bell silent for another hour. The broken handle of the letter opener lay on the table beside her, its silver dulled by age and use. She studied it with pursed lips. It was plain, unmarked, yet its presence by the pond struck her as far too deliberate to be coincidence. At 8 o'clock, the vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Banbury, stopped by under the pretext of returning a borrowed umbrella, but really to deliver the latest village whispers. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly, setting down the dripping umbrella. "They say the inspectors found blood on the missing bit of that letter opener. And now Mr. Clay's been called back to the manor. Something about a new witness. Though who could have seen anything in that rain, I can't imagine." Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea. "Most curious," she said. "I wonder, Mrs. Banbury, has anyone heard from Mrs. Barnes yet?" "Not a word," the woman replied, eyes wide. "Vanished into thin air, that one. Some say she's gone off in fright. Others, well, they think she might have done it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "though one should be careful not to mistake silence for guilt. Sometimes it simply hides fear." By mid-morning she decided she had heard enough second-hand talk. Pulling on her raincoat, she set off again toward the manor. The road was still muddy, and the air held that peculiar chill that follows a night of storm, when every sound seems amplified, the crunch of gravel, the caw of distant crows, even the faint echo of her own footsteps. When she arrived, Inspector Graves was waiting on the terrace, looking rather harassed. "I might have known you'd turn up," he said without malice. "You've a nose for trouble, Miss Marple. You'd make a fine constable if you weren't so infernally polite about it." "Flattery at this hour, Inspector," she replied with a smile. "You must be desperate for good company." He gave a dry chuckle. "Well, I've got news. The post-mortem came through this morning. Lady Agatha didn't drown. She'd been poisoned, arsenic in her lemonade most likely. Small dose, carefully administered." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Arsenic? How very old-fashioned. One might almost call it sentimental." "Sentimental or not, it killed her," the inspector said grimly. "And that letter opener you found, it was used afterward to stage a bit of misdirection. The missing blade turned up near the compost heap with a smear of her blood. Looks like someone wanted us to think she was attacked by the pond. A clumsy attempt to confuse the timeline." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Then her death occurred before the body was moved. How curious that no one saw it happen in such a public setting." "That's what puzzles me," he admitted. "Dozens of people about, yet not one saw a thing. Unless someone slipped something into her glass before the fete began." "Possibly," she said softly, her gaze wandering toward the windows of the drawing-room. "Or else someone who knew her habits rather too well ensured she drank nothing else once the fete was underway." Graves frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Miss Marple said, "that this was no crime of opportunity. It was planned by someone who understood her routines intimately. Such knowledge doesn't come from gossip, Inspector. It comes from proximity. They entered the manor together. The house seemed darker than before, its halls muffled and close. Lawrence Vane stood at the far end of the corridor speaking with the solicitor, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. When he noticed them, he forced a strained smile. "More questions, Inspector. I'm beginning to feel like a criminal already." "That depends on your answers," Graves replied. "You were seen near the refreshment table shortly before your aunt made her announcement. Did you prepare her drink?" Lawrence's smile faltered. "She asked me to fetch it for her, yes, lemonade, but that hardly makes me a murderer." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "Of course not. Still, it does mean that whoever tampered with the glass must have done so before it reached you. The question then is who had access to it beforehand," Clay interjected quickly. "Almost everyone, I'd imagine." The serving table was crowded. Mrs. Lacey and her husband were standing there not 5 minutes before Lady Agatha spoke. Even young Emily Barnes was passing out napkins. The inspector turned. "And you, Mr. Clay?" "I?" Clay's voice wavered. "I'd no reason to harm her. She was my client." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "Forgive me, Mr. Clay, but clients can be most inconvenient when they change their wills unexpectedly. I believe you mentioned she never signed the new draft." He hesitated. "That's true, but I left it for her review. I assure you it was not in my interest for her to die before doing so." Lawrence's laugh was short and bitter. "On the contrary, It seems to have benefited everyone but me." He turned toward the window, jaw tight. "I suppose you'll find some way to pin this on me too." "Not yet," said Graves. "But don't leave the village." When they left the manor, Miss Marple was silent for some distance. The inspector finally asked, "What do you think of him?" "I think," she said slowly, "that guilt rarely presents itself in anger. It hides behind calmness or behind fear." He gave her a sideways look. "Then which do you see in Lawrence Vane?" "Both," she replied softly, "which makes him either very guilty or very frightened of someone who is." That afternoon, as she returned home, Miss Marple found another envelope waiting on her doorstep. It was smaller than the first, the handwriting neater. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single line written in pencil: "Look in the West Wing cellar before dark." Her pulse did not quicken. Her face did not change. But she folded the paper with care and placed it in her pocket beside the broken letter opener. Then she fetched her walking stick, wrapped her shawl about her shoulders, and set out once more toward Weeping Manor. The sun was already low when she arrived, and the shadows stretched long across the lawns. She slipped in through the servants' entrance, where the air smelled faintly of coal and soap. The corridor beyond was silent, save for the ticking of an unseen clock. She followed it toward the west wing, her footsteps soundless on the worn stone. At the end of the passage was a narrow staircase leading down to the cellar. The door at the top hung ajar, as though waiting for her. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before lifting her lamp. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, and the air grew colder as she descended. The smell of damp earth filled her nose. Then from the darkness below came a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing. She paused, one hand on the rail. "Is someone there?" she called gently. A figure shifted in the shadows, and a small, frightened voice answered, "Miss Marple." "Oh, thank God, it's me, Mrs. Barnes." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, though her tone remained calm. "My dear, whatever are you doing hiding down here?" The housekeeper's reply came in a trembling whisper. "Because, Miss Marple, if they find me, they'll kill me next." For a moment the darkness seemed to close in around them, broken only by the flickering light of Miss Marple's small lamp. The old stone walls of the cellar were slick with damp, and a faint trickle of water echoed somewhere in the distance. Mrs. Barnes stood near a stack of coal sacks, her apron stained and her hands trembling. Her face, usually ruddy and brisk, was pale with terror. "My dear Mrs. Barnes," Miss Marple said softly, lowering the lamp so its light fell gently between them, "you mustn't be afraid. No one will harm you while I am here. But you must tell me what you know, quietly and from the beginning." The housekeeper's breath came unevenly. "It was the night before the fete, ma'am. I was cleaning the study as usual when I heard voices. Lady Agatha and Mr. Clay. They were arguing something dreadful. I couldn't make out every word, but she was angry about the new will. Said she wouldn't sign a thing that left the manor to anyone but her family. He told her she'd regret crossing him." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A serious accusation. "Are you certain of his words?" "I swear it, ma'am. He stormed out, and I thought that was the end of it. But later that night, when I was banking the fires, I saw him come back through the garden door. I didn't think Lady Agatha knew. The next morning she seemed fine, cheerful even, but when the fete began, well, you know what happened." Miss Marple's voice remained calm, though her thoughts raced. "And afterward? Why did you hide here?" Mrs. Barnes twisted her apron in her hands. "Because I saw him again, ma'am, after she was found. He went into her study and came out with a paper. I knew then he'd taken the new will. I meant to go to the police, truly I did, but when I went to fetch my coat I found a note on my bed. It said, 'You've seen too much.' I didn't know what else to do but hide." Miss Marple regarded her in silence for a long moment. The woman's fear was genuine. The tremor in her voice could not be feigned. "You've done the right thing by telling me," she said at last. "But we must be cautious. There are those who would rather this truth never see daylight." The sound of footsteps above made Mrs. Barnes flinch. Miss Marple raised her hand gently. "Not a word. she whispered. The steps moved across the floorboards, paused and then receded toward the far end of the house. Only when the silence returned did she speak again. "We shall go now quietly. Follow me and stay close." They ascended the stairs, Miss Marple holding the lamp low to avoid casting shadows through the half-open door. The corridor above was empty, though a faint draught hinted that another door somewhere had been left ajar. She led Mrs. Barnes toward the servants' entrance and out into the cool evening air. The sky was heavy with cloud, the first drops of rain beginning to fall again. "Go to my cottage," Miss Marple said in a low voice. "There's a key beneath the geranium pot by the window. Lock the door and wait for me. Tell no one you've returned." Mrs. Barnes nodded shakily and hurried down the path, vanishing into the mist. Miss Marple watched until the figure disappeared, then turned back toward the manor. She did not enter immediately, but moved instead along the side of the house toward the study windows. Through the glass a light burned, a single lamp on the desk. Inside, Edmund Clay stood alone, rifling through a drawer with hurried movements. His face was taut, his expression grim. She lingered just long enough to see him take something from the drawer, a folded paper, perhaps the will, and slip it into his coat. Then, with a last glance toward the corridor, he extinguished the lamp and left the room. Miss Marple waited a moment, then crossed to the main door. Inspector Graves arrived almost at the same time, his lantern swinging. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour?" he demanded. "Ah, Inspector," she said mildly, "just in time. I believe our solicitor friend has been doing a bit of late-night filing. You might want to ask him what documents he's carrying in his coat." Graves frowned but obeyed, striding through the door and calling sharply for Clay. There was a flurry of movement within, the clatter of a chair, the hurried footsteps of a man attempting to flee, but within moments the inspector reappeared, grim satisfaction on his face. "You were right. He had the draft will and Lady Agatha's jewelry box in his possession. Says he was protecting them." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Protecting is such a convenient word, isn't it? One that often conceals rather than clarifies." They went together into the study, where the scent of old paper and faded perfume still lingered. On the desk lay an overturned cup, its rim stained faintly with yellow residue. Miss Marple lifted it delicately with her handkerchief. "Arsenic," she murmured. "No doubt the same that killed Lady Agatha. And see here, the faint impression of a second cup beside it, removed after the fact. Someone was careful enough to tidy away their own evidence, but not hers." Graves leaned closer. "You think Clay poisoned her?" She shook her head slowly. "No, Mr. Clay's clever enough to forge a will or conceal one, but not bold enough for murder. His crimes are cowardly ones, paper and ink, not poison. Then who?" Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the small framed photograph on the mantel. Lady Agatha and a younger Lawrence Vane, smiling stiffly beside a motor car. "The nephew fetched her lemonade," she said softly. "But if the poison was already there, he's only an unwitting accomplice. Still, the one who placed it there must have known he would be the one to bring it to her. Someone who knew both his habits and hers." The inspector frowned. "That narrows it down to the Lacys, or the servants. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "to someone who wished both to inherit and to be pitied. Someone who could feign distress convincingly, and yet hold their nerve while others panicked." Graves stared. "You don't mean Mrs. Lacey?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. She turned instead to the window, where the wind stirred the curtains. She was by the refreshment table moments before Lady Agatha's announcement. She was jealous of her husband's admiration for the old lady, and resentful of her wealth. "The doctor's practice is failing, I believe. Debts mounting. Poison, after all, is often the refuge of the desperate." The inspector rubbed his chin. "I'll need proof." "You shall have it soon enough," she said. "For now, keep Mr. Clay under watch, and perhaps send an officer to the Lacey's home. I rather think our doctor's wife will be packing a bag." When she finally returned home, the cottage was dark except for the faint glow from the sitting room. Mrs. Barnes sat by the fire, her face weary but calmer now. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've been very brave, my dear. It will soon be over." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the hills. Miss Marple moved to the window, drawing the curtain aside just in time to see a figure hurrying along the lane toward the railway road. A woman in a dark coat, clutching a small suitcase. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Ah," she murmured, "so very human to flee when one has almost escaped justice." She turned to Mrs. Barnes, her expression thoughtful but resolute. "It seems, my dear, that tomorrow will be a rather important day in St. Mildred's. The truth, I think, has nearly finished its journey to the surface." The morning broke pale and cold, a faint mist clinging to the hedgerows, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple, as was her custom, was already awake before dawn. She moved quietly about her cottage, setting the kettle on and folding her shawl neatly over the back of her chair. The events of the night weighed on her, though not with fear, rather with that particular sense of clarity that follows when the final pieces of a puzzle are almost, but not quite, aligned. She had slept little, her mind circling the same small cluster of facts. The arsenic in the lemonade, the missing will, Mrs. Barnes's testimony, and the strange mixture of panic and composure that Mrs. Lacey had shown in the hours after the fete. By 7 o'clock, a light knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found Inspector Graves standing on the step, his coat damp with early fog. His expression was tired but resolute. "She's gone," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Lacey packed a case and left before dawn. The housekeeper says she claimed she was visiting her sister in Bath, but there's no train scheduled that early. My men are checking the stations now." Miss Marple nodded slowly, unsurprised. "A woman who runs does not always intend to escape, Inspector. Sometimes she only wishes to delay the inevitable." He followed her inside, the faint scent of tea and lavender greeting him as she poured 2 cups. "You still think she did it, then?" "I think she had motive, opportunity, and temperament," Miss Marple replied gently. "But motive alone does not make a murderer. Nor does fear, though it can certainly drive one to foolish acts." Graves sipped his tea, glancing around the small room with its tidy stacks of books and the faint tick of the mantel clock. "Mrs. Barnes told you Clay came back that night to steal the will. That checks with what we found. But if Mrs. Lacey was behind the poisoning, why let him take it?" "Because she likely saw no harm in it," Miss Marple said. "To her mind the will was merely a document, an inconvenience, not a danger. She would have been too preoccupied with ensuring her deception remained undiscovered. And poor Mr. Clay, foolish as he is, may have unwittingly served her purpose by drawing attention elsewhere." The inspector frowned. "Still doesn't sit right. What about Dr. Lacey? You think he knew?" Miss Marple set her cup down delicately. "I believe he knows more than he admits. The man's hands were shaking when we first spoke, and not merely from shock. He is burdened, Inspector, burdened by conscience. Whether that burden is guilt or grief remains to be seen." They were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A constable entered, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, sir, but we've just had a message from the station master at Milchester. Mrs. Lacey bought a ticket for London, not Bath. She boarded the 6:15. Graves's jaw tightened. "London, eh? That's as good as vanishing for most people." Miss Marple rose, her expression serene but purposeful. "Not for everyone, Inspector. You'll find she isn't running from capture. She's running to someone she trusts, perhaps someone she thinks can help her. Who would that be?" "The doctor, of course." "He's not in the village, is he?" Graves blinked. "No. His assistant said he went to Milchester early this morning on a medical call. I thought nothing of it." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "There we are, then. The two of them together. Her foolish thing, really. Running only confirms suspicion." The inspector straightened, his tiredness replaced by renewed determination. "Right. I'll have a man telegraph ahead to Milchester and alert the authorities at Paddington. They won't get far. When he had gone, Miss Marple stood for a long while by the window, watching the mist lift from the green. She could almost picture the Lacys on the train, Penelope clutching her handbag, her face pale and tense while her husband stared out of the window, avoiding her eyes. A strange pair, those two, bound by affection and deceit in equal measure. She had seen that sort of partnership before, the quiet collusion born not of love but of shared desperation. By afternoon, word came that the couple had been detained at Paddington Station. The inspector arrived again, his coat dusted with soot from the train. "We've got them," he said shortly. "They didn't even resist. But it's odd. Mrs. Lacey insists her husband knew nothing about it, claims she acted alone." Miss Marple's expression softened. The instinct to protect. It survives even where love has long since died. They went together to the station house, where the Lacys were being held. Mrs. Lacey sat behind the bars, still elegant despite her travel-stained coat. Her husband stood beside her, his face drawn and hollow. When Miss Marple entered, Penelope's eyes widened with something like despair. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Miss Marple moved closer to the cell, her tone gentle, almost motherly. "My dear, it is far too late for should or should not. You know as well as I do that this must end." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "I never meant to kill her," she said, her voice trembling. "Only to frighten her a little. She'd been mocking Harold, calling him incompetent, saying she'd cut us off in her will. I slipped a bit of arsenic from the surgery drawer, just enough to make her ill. But she was older than I thought. I didn't realize how little it would take." Dr. Lacey groaned softly, covering his face. "Penelope, why didn't you tell me?" "Because you'd have stopped me," she said, her voice breaking. "And then what would we have had left? Debts, shame, nothing more." Inspector Graves's expression hardened, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "She speaks the truth, I think. It was pride, not malice, that led her here. And pride is a most dangerous poison in itself." Mrs. Lacey clutched the bars. "I didn't move the body. I swear I didn't. When I saw her fall, I panicked and ran to find Harold. He was the one who said we must tell no one until we were certain." The doctor looked up, his eyes hollow. "I thought perhaps she'd died of a seizure. I examined her. There was nothing I could do. And when the inspector arrived, God help me, I said nothing." The silence that followed was heavy with pity and inevitability. Graves turned to Miss Marple. "You've done it again," he said quietly. "Though I'd have rather not believed it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is never pleasant, Inspector, to find that tragedy grows from such small ordinary roots. A touch of envy, a bruised ego, a careless dose, and there lies the ruin of 3 lives." As the Lacys were led away, Miss Marple lingered by the window of the station house. Outside, the mist had finally lifted, revealing the quiet village road bathed in the late afternoon sun. "It's a strange thing," she murmured, half to herself, "how quickly wickedness can seem to dissolve once it is named aloud. But it never truly leaves. It lingers, in whispers, in memories, in the faint taste of bitterness left behind." Inspector Graves, standing beside her, gave a small nod. "You've a grim way of seeing the world, Miss Marple." She smiled kindly. "Not grim, Inspector, merely realistic. After all, one must understand human nature to forgive it. And with that—" She took up her umbrella and left the station, walking home through the fading light as the church bell began to toll the hour, slow and solemn, across the green. The path back to St. Mildred's seemed longer that evening, as though the village itself had drawn inward, in quiet contemplation of the scandal that had settled over it. The faint sound of the church bell still echoed behind Miss Marple as she walked steady and unhurried through the gathering dusk. Her thoughts were calm but not content. The confession, though complete in form, left a faint unease in her mind, a feeling that something essential had not yet been accounted for. It was a habit of hers, when mysteries appeared concluded, to sift once more through their ashes, searching for a spark that refused to die. By the time she reached her gate, twilight had deepened into full night. The village green was empty, the windows of the vicarage glowing softly across the way. Inside her cottage, Mrs. Barnes dozed in an armchair by the fire, her face finally free of the fear that had haunted it. Miss Marple closed the door quietly behind her, hung her shawl and sat down opposite the flames. "It's done, then?" Mrs. Barnes asked, waking with a start. "For the most part," Miss Marple said. "The Lacys have confessed, though as confessions go, theirs is curiously convenient. One must always be cautious, my dear, when guilt arranges itself too neatly." The housekeeper frowned, puzzled. "But she said she poisoned the lemonade herself." "Indeed. And perhaps she did," Miss Marple replied, stirring the fire with the poker. "Yet certain details still trouble me. You see, I cannot quite reconcile the timing. If Lady Agatha drank her lemonade before the announcement, she would have felt the effects almost immediately. But she appeared quite herself, composed, articulate, not a hint of distress until several minutes later." Mrs. Barnes's brow furrowed. Then maybe the poison wasn't in the glass she gave her." "Precisely the question," Miss Marple murmured. "Arsenic requires a carrier. Sugar syrup, perhaps, or fruit cordial. Someone must have added it after the drink was poured." A log cracked in the hearth, sending a small shower of sparks upward. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, the rhythm of thought steady behind them. She recalled the fete, the laughter, the band's off-key tune, the way Lawrence Vane had stood near the refreshment table, his easy smile not quite reaching his eyes. He had fetched the lemonade at his aunt's request, yes, but who had handed it to him? Mrs. Barnes's voice broke into her thoughts. "You think it wasn't Mrs. Lacey after all?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that Mrs. Lacey was telling the truth about her intention, but not about her act. She might have taken the arsenic, might even have planned to use it, but someone else turned her folly into murder." The housekeeper's hand went to her mouth. "Mr. Clay?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Clay is greedy, not daring. His sins are of pen and paper. But there is one person in this affair whose cleverness has been consistently underestimated." The clock struck 9. A wind began to stir outside, brushing against the windows. Miss Marple rose, fetched her coat once more, and said, "Stay here, Mrs. Barnes. If I am not back within the hour, fetch the inspector." The housekeeper looked terrified. "Where are you going, miss?" "To Weeping Manor," she said simply. "It seems the house has not yet finished weeping." The road to the manor was almost deserted. Clouds gathered thickly over the treetops, and now and again a shiver of lightning flickered far off across the hills. As she neared the great iron gates, she saw a single lamp burning in one of the upper windows, the west wing where Lady Agatha's study lay. The police had sealed the room that morning. Someone had broken that seal. Miss Marple entered through the servants' door, the echo of her footsteps muffled by the thick stone. The house was utterly silent. She moved carefully through the corridor, guided by the faint glimmer of light from above. At the landing she paused. Voices drifted faintly from the study, low, urgent, unmistakably male. "You fool," said one voice, tight with fury. "I told you to burn it, not keep it." "I couldn't," came the reply, trembling. "It's her handwriting. She signed it, Lawrence." "She changed everything." Miss Marple froze. There was a sharp rustle of paper, then the sound of a scuffle, a muffled cry. She stepped forward just in time to see Lawrence Vane shove Edmund Clay against the wall, snatching a document from his hand. The solicitor staggered, clutching his shoulder, his face white. "Miss Marple," he gasped when he saw her in the doorway. He means to kill me." Lawrence turned, startled, but recovering almost instantly, that easy charm flickering once more across his features. "My dear Miss Marple," he said, his voice soft and dangerous, "you do have a talent for appearing at the most inconvenient moments." She regarded him steadily. "You've done something very foolish, Mr. Vane. The inspector will be here within minutes." He laughed. "Oh, I doubt that. I told the constable on duty I was retrieving my aunt's jewellery for inventory. They won't expect anyone else to come calling in this storm." Miss Marple stepped closer, her tone almost conversational. "It was you all along, wasn't it? You knew about Mrs. Lacey's little theft from the surgery. And you made use of it. You switched the drinks when no one was watching. Clever but careless, you counted on her guilt to mask your own. His smile faltered. You've no proof. Proof is rarely the heart of truth, Mr. Vane. It is behavior. You showed too much composure for a grieving nephew. And when you found the scarf on the gates, you were the first to suggest it might have been there for days. Yet it was you who placed it there, to draw attention away from the pond where you'd already planned to dispose of her. Clay stared at him in disbelief. You killed her for the manor? For what was mine by right? Lawrence snapped. She promised it. She promised it before she turned on me. That new will left everything to the church. 2 strangers. Lady Agatha signed it, Miss Marple said softly, nodding toward the document in his hand. You found it last night and couldn't bring yourself to destroy it. Not out of guilt, out of pride. You wanted to keep it as proof that she betrayed you. For a moment his facade cracked, and the anguish beneath showed itself. You know nothing about it, he said hoarsely. I didn't mean to kill her. She was drinking her lemonade, laughing. Then she said she'd make the announcement about the will after all. I just wanted to stop her. Only a few drops, I thought. Just enough to make her faint, not die. Miss Marple's eyes were filled with quiet pity. Poison, Mr. Vane, like greed, is rarely so precise. The thunder rolled closer. Clay had edged toward the door, but Lawrence caught his sleeve, dragging him back. You'll hang with me if you talk, he hissed. Not if the inspector arrives first, Miss Marple said calmly, turning her gaze toward the window. I imagine he'll be here any moment. You see, I left a note for him before I came. Lawrence spun toward the window as the sound of footsteps and shouts echoed from below. For a brief, wild instant, his face twisted. Not with guilt, but with sheer disbelief that the gentle old woman before him had outwitted him. Then, with a curse, he hurled the paper into the fire and bolted for the corridor. Inspector Graves burst through the door moments later, followed by 2 constables. The men seized Lawrence before he could reach the stairs. The document was gone, but the confession remained, in every word, every gesture, every frantic glance. As they led him away, Miss Marple stood quietly by the hearth, watching the last edges of the will curl into ash. So ends the curse of Weeping Manor, she murmured. Not by ghosts, but by the same frailty that haunts us all. And when the flames at last subsided, the house fell silent, save for the soft patter of rain against the old stone walls. Tears, perhaps, for the truth finally laid bare. The rain fell harder as the night deepened, beating against the windows of Weeping Manor in a relentless rhythm that seemed almost alive. The house, relieved of its last great secret, stood silent and weary, its burden finally spoken aloud. Lawrence Vane had been taken away under heavy guard, his face pale and set, a strange calmness overtaking the fury that had marked his earlier outburst. Inspector Graves and his men had scoured the study for what little remained of evidence. The ashes of the will, the shattered remnants of a glass. But Miss Marple lingered behind, her gaze fixed on the dying embers in the hearth. When at last the inspector returned to the room, rubbing the rain from his brow, she turned to him. "It's done, then?" she asked quietly. "As done as it can be," Graves replied. "He's confessed. Said everything you predicted. Claimed it wasn't meant to kill her, just frighten her, as if that makes a difference." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, sorrowful smile. "Few murderers ever intend the full consequence of their acts, Inspector. That's what makes it so tragic. They believe themselves capable of managing the outcome until the outcome manages them." Graves sighed, taking a seat near the desk. "You know, Miss Marple, I'll never understand how you see it all so clearly. I had the Lacys pegged. Would have sworn by it. It's natural to follow the loudest quarrel," she said, gently folding her hands. "But guilt is rarely noisy, Inspector. It hides in the quiet gestures, the things people do not say. Mr. Vane was too polished, too certain, and yet his certainty never quite reached his eyes. The guilty seldom trust themselves to look innocent." He nodded, half admiring, half defeated. "I suppose that's true enough. Still, it's a devilish business." "I don't think I'll forget that face of his in a hurry." She did not answer immediately. Her gaze had wandered to the window, where the storm had begun to ease. The air outside shimmered faintly with the promise of dawn. "He loved her, you know," Miss Marple said at last, "in his own way. People rarely kill those they hate entirely. It's affection twisted by pride that does the worst harm." The inspector gave a low whistle. "You've a grim philosophy, Miss Marple." "Not grim, merely observant," she replied. "In every murder I've ever encountered, there lies a heart that once meant well. Evil seldom begins in malice, it begins in pain. They left the manor together an hour later, the constables locking up behind them. The village lay still beneath a wash of early light, mist rising from the fields. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the fire had gone out, and Mrs. Barnes was awake, waiting anxiously in her shawl. "Is it true?" she asked at once. "They've taken him." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, removing her damp gloves. "Lawrence Vane will stand trial. He's admitted everything." Mrs. Barnes shuddered. "And to think I served him tea every week when he was a boy. He was such a sweet child." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Children are rarely the same people they grow into, my dear. Life molds them, sometimes too harshly." She sank into her chair, weary but composed. The small comforts of home, the ticking clock, the faint scent of lavender polish, the familiar creak of the floorboards, seemed to draw the tension from her shoulders. "Do you know," she said after a pause, "I think this business has affected the village more deeply than it yet realizes. St. Mildred's thrives on the illusion that evil comes from outside, from strangers. But it has been among us all along, quietly sitting at our tables." Mrs. Barnes nodded gravely, then hesitated. "Will there be a trial?" "Oh, undoubtedly. The Crown will insist upon it. But I imagine his confession will shorten the process considerably. He'll likely plead guilty." The housekeeper sighed and rose to fetch fresh tea, her movements slow with fatigue. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning again to Weeping Manor. She saw the house in her memory, shrouded in ivy and sadness, and thought how strange it was that a place could seem alive in its grief. Later that morning, Inspector Graves called once more, this time less as a policeman and more as a friend. "I thought you'd like to know," he said, accepting a scone from Mrs. Barnes with a grateful nod. "They found what's left of the will in the fireplace. Most of it's ash, but a fragment survived. Enough to verify your theory. Lady Agatha really had changed the inheritance to benefit the parish orphanage." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Then he wasn't lying when he said she betrayed him, in his mind at least." Graves nodded. "Seems she meant to make a new start. Sell part of the estate, turn the rest into something charitable. Shame she never got the chance." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window again, to where the green stretched peaceful and untroubled beneath the sun. "Perhaps it's fitting in a way," she said quietly. "The house wept for years under its burdens. Now it may finally rest." He smiled faintly. "You really do make it sound like the place had a soul." "Oh, all old houses do," she replied. "They absorb the emotions of their inhabitants. That's why Weeping Manor will never be quite free of sorrow. But neither, I think, will it breed more." They spoke a while longer of formalities and reports. Then the inspector took his leave, tipping his hat in the old-fashioned way that always amused her. When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple remained seated, her teacup untouched, her thoughts wandering far beyond the walls of her cottage. The day passed slowly, and by evening the news had spread across the county. Visitors would come, no doubt. Journalists, curious travellers, those drawn to the legend of the manor that mourned its mistress. But to Miss Marple the matter was closed. She had seen too many such endings to find satisfaction in them. Justice, though necessary, seldom brought joy. As the lamps were lit and twilight deepened, she took out her knitting, the rhythmic motion steadying her mind. Outside, the first stars began to pierce the sky. Somewhere across the green, the church bell tolled softly. Once, twice, then fell silent. Miss Marple looked up from her work and murmured to herself, "In every village there lies a story waiting to be told." And in every story, a truth that prefers to whisper rather than shout. Then she smiled faintly, as if at a private recollection, and returned to her knitting. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the quiet, and though the manor on the hill stood empty at last, its windows dark, a single tear of rain slid down one pane, catching the moonlight, weeping Manor's final farewell. It was several weeks before calm truly returned to St. Mildred's on the Green. The newspapers had long since carried the story away. Weeping Manor mystery, nephew confesses to poisoning of Lady Vane. The headlines sold well for a few days before giving way to fresher scandals. But in the village itself, the aftermath moved more quietly, as such things always did. People still lowered their voices when they passed the manor gates. Even the birds seemed slower to sing near its hedges. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her accustomed life of knitting, gardening, and listening, though anyone who knew her well could sense that her thoughts had not entirely left the matter. On an afternoon touched by early autumn, she walked toward the churchyard where the grass had just been cut, and the air smelled faintly of rosemary from the vicar's border. Lady Agatha had been buried in the family plot, beneath a modest stone that bore only her name and the inscription, "She kept her own counsel." Miss Marple found that curiously fitting. Few people ever truly knew Lady Agatha Vane, perhaps not even the one who killed her. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Banbury, joined her among the headstones, clutching a posy of wildflowers. "Such a dreadful affair," she sighed, placing them by the grave. "Still, I suppose the village will settle now. Evil has a way of drifting off when its work is done." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Evil doesn't drift, my dear. It lingers. But it can be quieted, for a time." They spoke for a while about ordinary things, the fate that might be revived next spring, the Colonel's new motor car, the parish roof repairs. Yet beneath the domestic chatter ran an undercurrent of unease. St. Mildred's had glimpsed itself too clearly in the mirror of tragedy, and such reflections are not easily forgotten. That evening Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Graves appeared at her door, hat in hand, his expression uncertain. "Forgive me dropping by," he said. "I was passing through on my way back to Milchester, and thought you'd want to hear the last of it. Vane's trial was this morning." "Ah," she said softly, gesturing him to a chair. "And the verdict?" "Guilty, of course. The jury barely left the room. He'll be sentenced next week." There wasn't much to argue after his confession. Miss Marple poured him tea without comment. When he accepted the cup, he hesitated. "He asked to speak to me afterward. Said he wanted a message delivered to you." "To me?" Her voice was mild, but her knitting paused in mid-stitch. Graves nodded. He said, "Tell Miss Marple she was right about one thing. I didn't hate her. I only wanted her to see me, whatever that means." Miss Marple's gaze lowered. "It means," she said quietly, "that he wished his aunt to recognize him as the man he believed himself to be, capable, deserving, worthy of her legacy. When she refused, he sought to prove his importance in the only way pride allowed him." The inspector studied her, uneasy. "You almost make me pity him." "One should pity him," she replied. "Pity, not pardon. Those who destroy out of vanity are already punished, Inspector. They live long enough to know they've undone themselves." For a while they sat in companionable silence. Rain began to patter softly against the window panes, and the scent of damp earth drifted in. Graves finished his tea and rose. "Well," he said, forcing a small smile, "I suppose that's the end of it. The manor will be sold. Some London family, no doubt. The curse will have new listeners." Miss Marple followed him to the door. "Perhaps," she said, "but curses only repeat when lessons are forgotten. Let us hope these new owners have simpler hearts." After he left, she remained standing in the doorway, watching the mist curl over the hedges. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, then all was still. She thought of Lady Agatha, proud, imperious, yet strangely lonely, and of Lawrence, who had loved her in the only way he knew, by trying to possess what should have been freely given. Human nature, she mused, never really changed. It merely found new stages for its follies. The days passed and autumn deepened. The manor stood empty but for a caretaker, its windows shuttered, the ivy thickening along its walls. Children dared one another to run up to the gates after dusk, whispering that they could hear the house crying again when the wind turned east. Miss Marple smiled at their tales, but never dismissed them outright. Imagination, she believed, was often a gentler guardian of truth than denial. One evening, as the church bell marked 6, she took her customary walk toward the green. The sky was a wash of rose and silver. Smoke curled lazily from the cottages. At the pond where Lady Agatha's body had been found, the lilies had withered, leaving the water clear enough to mirror the clouds. Miss Marple stood there a moment, remembering the chaos of that day, the scream, the crowd, the sudden stillness, and thought how curious it was that life could resume its rhythm so quickly after breaking. Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel. It was young Emily Barnes, the vicar's niece, carrying a basket of apples. "Good evening, Miss Marple. The harvest supper's being planned already. They say you must sit at the head table this year." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I think not, my dear. I much prefer to watch from the side. One sees rather more that way." Emily laughed, but then her expression grew thoughtful. "Do you really think the manor was cursed, Miss Marple?" The old lady looked out across the pond, her eyes gentle and wise. "Not cursed exactly, only steeped in unhappiness. When too many secrets are kept in one place, they begin to seep into the walls. But unhappiness, like poison, can be washed away with time and honesty." Emily nodded solemnly, then hurried on toward the vicarage. Miss Marple remained a while longer, the evening light fading around her. A cool breeze stirred the reeds, carrying with it the faintest echo of water against stone, a sound that might have been the manor sighing in its sleep. At last she turned for home. The lamps in the village were beginning to glow, each window a small island of warmth against the encroaching night. When she reached her gate, she paused and looked once more toward the distant outline of Weeping Manor. For the first time in months, no light shone from its windows. It stood entirely dark, perfectly still, as though listening. Miss Marple smiled to herself and whispered, "Rest now, my dear house. Your tears have told their tale." Then she went inside, closed the door, and settled by the hearth. The fire crackled, the kettle began to sing, and her knitting resumed its quiet rhythm. Outside, the rain started again, soft, cleansing, unthreatening. The manor on the hill seemed to breathe with it, the ivy glistening like tears turned to silver. And in that tender, murmuring night, the village of St. Mildred's, once shaken by death and deceit, folded itself back into peace, its secrets for now all spoken, its ghosts at last at rest. The following Sunday dawned bright and clear, the sort of English morning that seemed to promise renewal. A soft light bathed the village green, and the air was rich with the scent of wet grass and distant baking. The parish bells rang for service, their notes carrying across the rooftops of St. Mildred's on the Green. For the first time in many months, peace felt genuine, fragile still but real. Miss Marple walked slowly to the church, her steps measured, her parasol tapping lightly against the cobbles. The villagers greeted her as they passed, Mrs. Banbury with her perpetual bustle, Colonel Trevelyan with his booming cheer, and even young Emily Barnes, smiling shyly as she hurried ahead with her hymnal. Life, thought Miss Marple, had a remarkable way of mending itself around tragedy, though never quite in the same shape as before. Inside the church, shafts of golden light slanted through the stained glass windows. The vicar's voice, warm and steady, filled the small nave as he spoke of forgiveness, truth, and the quiet strength of conscience. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind calm. The trial, the confessions, the endless questions, all of it now seemed very far away, part of a pattern that had finally completed itself. Yet she felt, as she often did at the end of such affairs, a touch of melancholy. Justice, while necessary, seldom left joy in its wake, After the service, she lingered by the lich gate while others exchanged pleasantries. Inspector Graves approached her, his hat tucked beneath his arm. He looked different in the daylight, less a figure of authority, more simply a man tired by too much ugliness. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, offering a faint smile. "Thought I'd find you here. I wanted to bring you this." He held out a small envelope sealed in brown paper. She took it carefully. "What is it?" "Something from the magistrate's clerk," he said. "Lawrence Vane made a final request before he was sentenced. Said you should have this after the proceedings were done." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. When the inspector departed, she waited until the churchyard had emptied before opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of notepaper, neatly folded. "Miss Marple," it began in Lawrence Vane's elegant hand, "you once said that pride and affection are dangerous companions. You were right. I loved my aunt more than I ever understood, and when she withheld her approval, I mistook it for betrayal. If you read this, it means I have paid what must be paid. Tell those who cared for her that I was sorry, not for my punishment but for the pain I caused them. Weeping Manor should belong to the village. Let it serve something finer than vanity." Miss Marple folded the letter again, her eyes soft with an emotion too complex to name. "So even the proud can find grace at the end," she murmured. Then, after a moment's reflection, she added, "Perhaps that was the true ending all along. By autumn's close, the manor had indeed been sold, not to a London family, as many had expected, but to the parish council. It would become a small convalescent home for widows and war nurses, funded in part by the remnants of Lady Agatha's estate. The ivy was trimmed, the gardens revived, and laughter returned to the grounds where sorrow had lingered. The villagers began to speak of the house differently now, no longer as cursed but as redeemed. Even the children stopped whispering when they passed its gates. Miss Marple visited one last time before the renovations began. The caretaker met her at the door and, recognizing her, offered to show her around. She declined gently. "No need," she said. "I know every shadow and corner by heart." She walked instead to the rose garden, where the fountain still murmured softly beside the pond. The water was clear again, reflecting the afternoon sun in rippling gold. She sat for a long while on the old stone bench, her knitting in her lap, her thoughts elsewhere. In her mind's eye she saw Lady Agatha, standing once more on the lawn, parasol in hand, surrounded by laughter and gossip and the brittle beauty of village life. How easily such scenes fractured, Miss Marple thought, when pride and secrecy entered their gentle rhythms. And yet even shattered glass could catch the light again, if one knew where to look. A small voice startled her from her reverie. "Miss Marple." It was Emily Barnes, clutching a parcel wrapped in paper. "Mum sent me with a bit of seed cake for your tea." "How kind of her," said Miss Marple, smiling. "And how kind of you to deliver it. Tell your mother she has my thanks." Emily hesitated, glancing toward the house. "Do you think Lady Agatha would have liked it being turned into a home?" Miss Marple considered this. "Yes, my dear. Though she might never have admitted it while alive. Some souls prefer their goodness to be discovered after they're gone. It saves them the embarrassment of gratitude." The girl laughed softly and ran off down the path, her laughter echoing through the quiet garden. Miss Marple watched her go, the corners of her mouth lifting. When the sun began to dip, she rose and made her way back toward the village. At the gates of Weeping Manor, she turned for one last look. The windows glowed faintly in the evening light, and the air held the scent of newly turned soil. It no longer felt like a place of mourning, but of remembrance, a place that had learned at last to forgive itself. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and walked on, her steps light, her figure small and composed against the burnished horizon. The church bell struck 6 as she passed the green, each note slow and measured, folding into the calm of twilight, and if one stood very still on that road, listening as the sound faded, one might almost imagine the faintest sigh carried on the wind, the manor breathing in peace, Its long sorrow ended. Miss Marple, hearing it, smiled to herself. "Ah," she whispered, "so even weeping Manor can cease its tears." Then she disappeared into the soft golden haze of evening, her heart steady, her mind already turning, as ever, to the next quiet mystery that life would place before her.